Well, all right, my friends, let's do this. My name is David Parsons. You are listening to Nostalgia Trap. I thank you for doing so. I think you're going to enjoy what I've got for you today. My guest is Kristen Lovell. She is a filmmaker, got a documentary out right now on HBO called The Stroll. I highly recommend it to anybody who listens to this show because, you know, as we get into in this conversation, we've talked for years about gentrification, particularly around New York City. And its relationship to things like race and gender and class. And what this documentary is about is the history of the Meatpacking district, a very particular neighborhood in New York City. You may or may not have heard of it. If you've heard of it, I think you probably know a little bit of where we're going with this. The Meatpacking district changed dramatically. In the last 20 years, the place has turned into, it went from like this abandoned warehouse industrial space into like this luxury place with the Highline Park and the Standard Hotel and all these like high-end luxury stores. It's a place for rich people. But in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, when it was like this abandoned industrial space, it was a place in the city that almost exclusively transgender sex workers, mostly women of color, survived on the streets. Kristen Lovell was one of them. She has incredible stories to tell. And this documentary, like I said, it sort of gets at some of the connections we try to make on this show between architecture and urban planning and things like gender and class and race and all of that. So this was a really, really intense conversation and an intense documentary. I have a piece about it that's out this Saturday at Fast Company. I will link that piece to our Patreon page. So if you're a Patreon subscriber, you'll see that piece. This movie really just fucked me up, honestly. It's a history that I think is really, really important, and it's a take on gentrification that I don't think any of us have ever seen. So I had a really great time talking with Kristen. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Check out our Patreon page. There's a link in this episode description. We are a totally listener-supported project over here. We appreciate everyone who subscribes, and you get access to all of our documentaries and video essays and all the stuff we've been up to for years. You can actually right now go do a free trial and check all that stuff out for free if you want. We really appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. This is me talking with the director of The Stroll, Kristen Lovell. Kristen Lovell, it is such an honor to meet you and speak with you. Thank you for joining me and welcome to Nostalgia Trap.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited for this interview.
Well, you might not know anything about what we've been talking about on this podcast for years, but we've been talking about gentrification, gender, and issues like that. And when I saw your film, The Stroll, which is out now on HBO, and I guess it's just Max now, it was like you were able to condense so much of what we discuss on this show into an hour and 20 minutes. And it just seems like such a huge, complicated topic when you're talking about gentrification, transgender, women of color surviving as sex workers in the meatpacking district in New York City. Those topics seem like they could branch off into a million different stories. And while I was watching your documentary, I thought, there are like 50 different documentaries here on real estate and finance. And how did you sort of like focus your story? Like, what were the things that you just had to tell? Because it seems like this was easily a story that could spin out of control. It's like you're telling the story of the world here.
It was hard to pin down exactly what was most important for the story. We definitely wanted to focus the women of the Stroll within the film. And, it being a New York story, New York is a immersive place. You know what I mean? Like, New York is what it is. New York is a story within itself. So like, oh my God, I knew from like my firsthand accounts and what I was experiencing in my years of being on the street. I think my years of being a homeless young person has made me hyper aware and observant of everything that is going on around me.
Mm-hmm.
And so remembering like being in the streets and feeling how the city felt during like 9/11 and watching the Giuliani era play out. Like I remember in 1994 when he just came on as mayor, I was like, 14 or 15 years old and I was in the city and I littered. And a cop was like, you better pick that up. And it was so intense and scary. I was like, dude, like, calm down. It's just like a piece of trash or whatever, right? But he
Uh-huh.
literally made me pick it up. And then is when I realized I'm like, oh my God, these police are really like out of control, like trying to clean up this city. So I definitely wanted, and then like my experiences of going to Rikers Island and the reasons I was going, and I used to sit in the back of the paddy wagon, like, yo, like, y'all are really like infringing on my rights. Like, like it's
Yeah.
crazy. When I was going back and forth through the court system, I also realized from a lawyer that I had got that used to help me with a lot of my cases. And he was like, loitering with the intent to prostitute isn't even a crime. It's a violation. Somehow Giuliani was able to work the system and trump the charges up to like that of a misdemeanor. But loitering with the intent to prostitute is not a crime. It's a violation. And it should have been treated as such, but
When you
they
okay, so you're
were
talking about something
trying.
that's something that for people that don't know, it's something that's called the walking while trans law, or commonly known as that. And it's one of many examples during the Giuliani administration, into Bloomberg as well, where the police are sort of like using these sort of like loitering laws or whatever. And it's called broken windows policing, and that story is often told
Quality
like,
of life.
yeah, it's often told like from a sociological academic point of view. And your film is very really, I mean, it's really visceral. It's really like this is what it looks like from the people who are actually getting fucked with. And I wonder how much of it was conscious on the, yeah, because like you establish this like sort of sisterhood on the street, right? Of like the people who are doing this and surviving in this neighborhood. How much of it was like, oh shit, we know the hammer is coming down now? Like, how much was there
Well,
a discussion of that?
I knew that change was coming as soon as I saw the Kristen Louboutin store, or Louis Vuitton, or however you say it, Louboutin store. Once that store came and popped up in the middle of the meatpacking district, there are what we called the back streets. We knew that some changes were coming. I am very aware because at the time, as a homeless youth, we were being politicized because we knew that being a young trans person in the streets, you know, being disenfranchised and being domestically challenged, the violence and murder against young people at the time that went without impunity. You know what I mean? Like
Mm-hmm.
we had to be youth advocates for the lives of young people on the street because there were no services or protections. There was, like group homes and ACS or whatever, but when people discard their children because they're queer, what are they going to do? Because you're so afraid that they're queer, you serve them to the wolves and expose them to fates worse than they could have ever imagined just being queer. Some of us, when we were thrown out, weren't even sexually active. We were still trying to figure ourselves out. You know what I
Mm-hmm.
mean?
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
when you put us in that environment, we have no choice but to do what we have to do to survive. And sometimes that doesn't look good. You know what I
Right.
mean? But we had
Right.
to do what we had to do. Like you have to do something strange for some change. Every night you're put in a situation that could end your life. You know what I mean? You have to make, like I would always say, your moral compass then is destroyed because your survival becomes the utmost importance.
Well, that's what's clear in the passage about Rikers too, right? Is that you're sort of like there's a woman who says, I became a monster at Rikers because I had to survive. And that experience is something we know a little bit more about now, but it feels like this particular history you're telling, it's trippy to me because all this is happening in the 90s and the 2000s, which was in pop culture, a very like pro-gay moment, right? Like in pop culture, I mean, in the mainstream, and yet there's this population, and you do it. I think you make a really sort of clear sort of take on that of how this population of transgender women, especially of color, have been sort of left behind by a mainstream gay movement. But what was it like to find that clip of RuPaul? Because that clip is, I feel like that's such a
Well, right.
trippy clip.
RuPaul, came to fame with the song Supermodel. I was a teenager when it came out. I remember my mother was like, trying to figure out my gender identity and my sexuality. I was like, "Did you see this?" And I was like, "Oh, whatever." You know what I mean? Like I didn't want to at the time associate myself with, you know, the drag persona. I was
Mm.
sort of like, I guess you could say it was internalized transphobia, but I was still coming to terms with who I was, right? And as you said prior, you have to take in consideration that, you know, yeah, the 90s was the start of, being able to say the word gay and coming into pop culture. But the reasons why Stonewall happened to begin with is because the cops were coming in to make sure that, you know, people were not gender bending or wearing particular articles of clothing that doesn't define their gender identity,
Mm-hmm.
and that it was against the law for homosexuals to consume alcohol
Mm.
at that time. So you had the mob owning these bars and clubs and this like prohibition era, you know what I mean, and going in and cracking down on the trannies, excuse my language, and
Mm-hmm.
you know, and then but we only start after Stonewall in our film. We don't even talk about the history before Stonewall. Sylvia and Marsha were out there in the late 50s throughout their
That's
teen
the next
years.
documentary. That's the next one you're gonna make. Is that because I mean we're history people here on the show, and like the history that you show here, and just the continuity, all the footage you have of Sylvia Rivera, who for people that don't know, she's like I mean she comes off as like a Christ-like martyr figure in this film, as someone who was there at Stonewall, and yeah, I don't really know the history of her before what she was doing before.
Exactly. She was a young person who was thrown out of her home at a very young age. She was 12 years old, and she was thrust into the life of Times Square and sex work. And
Mm-hmm.
historically, Times Square has a long history of young people, young queer people coming and engaging in sex work in New York City. You know what I mean? So that was life before Stonewall. And then because of everything that was happening in Stonewall and those young people that were tossed into the streets, they had nothing to lose. They were already in the streets. They've already lost everything. They've already made these sacrifices. So they had no choice but to fight back. But somehow, like in the movie Stonewall, if you saw it by
Oh
Ronald
God,
Emmerich,
yeah.
he tosses the Marsha P. Johnson type character to the side, grabs the brick, and he's the savior of our liberation. And that
The
was
guy
like
that looks like
so
Matt Damon, right?
right.
Yeah.
And that wasn't the case. And still, 50 years after Stonewall, the trans community suffered and paid the price from the sixth precinct and became a constant target of harassment, violence, and whatever else.
Well, I mean, it's we live in a time right now where we're seeing like a right wing that's totally unleashed against trans people. And it's sort of insane to watch your film and understand like this sort of like local part of this because it's connected to. I mean, I don't know if how many people think about like architecture and New York City next to like gender and sex workers and things like that. But what your film does is makes you think about that connection. I wonder what we say to the people who like love the meatpacking district now and like love the Highline Park because it's your film is kind of exists as a corrective to a history that's sort of papered over in some way, if that
Oh, it
makes sense,
is.
right?
It definitely is papered over. It's like, oh, let's make this area look pretty and forget all of the trans women that were out there. I find it funny because, sort of similar is San Francisco, right? And the riot that took place maybe a couple of years before Stonewall, the Compton cafeteria. And look at all the progress that San Francisco has made now. That area is now called the transgender district. It highly recognizes the
Mm-hmm.
sacrifices of the trans community that
Mm-hmm.
paved that community. And I think New York owes it to the trans community to do the same thing. You know what I mean? Like I see all of the developments that are taking place right now in that area. You have the shiny new Whitney Museum that's there. You have, like all these new businesses and things that are popping up. I even seen like a drag poster, like advertising a drag show or something. And I was like, that's funny. It's sitting in the middle of this. But like, and now they're opening a $70 million beach right
Mm.
next to where the salt mines is, and where Sylvia's encampment was that you see in the film.
Wow. Wow.
And so I'm like, well, where does this fit in? Historically, the Titanic was supposed to dock there. Sylvia made it her home, but there has to be some kind of, I don't know, some dedication to show that historically we a civil rights leader lived here. Her
Mm.
partner, Marsha P. Johnson, died there, and so many others. How I'm interested to see how they will end up, paying homage to the trans people who spent so many decades out there trying to survive.
I wonder how you balance, because this is what I was thinking about the whole movie. This is a dark fucking story in a lot of ways. Like this story, it's of police coming after people that are already like living in the rubbish. Have already been pushed to the edge of existence, and now the police are going to come fuck with them, and homeowners too, who are going to be like, I don't want to see this on my street. Like it's a kind of enraging story. It's a dark story. How'd you balance that with the sort of like not wanting to just like be like transgender women are just victims, because there's an element of real community and real sort of vibrancy to this story too.
It was. I mean, I always, thankfully, I have Zachary and Matt, and Zachary was a blessing to this project because we share this deep love of trans history and uncovering things that we haven't seen before, right? And because I was in it, of course, it comes off as dark, but we wanted to keep the tone, and I realized like what was so integral to my survival out there was the optimism, was the hope, was the faith that the world will change.
Mm.
And I had to reflect that in the film. Like, there were times, the thing that kept us all together in the bullpens, was laughing and
Mm-hmm.
telling jokes and reading, you know what I mean? And it made the hours go by and it brought up your spirits from the situation because you don't know what's going to happen once you get inside Rikers Island. You know, when I listen to the stories of older trans and LGBT people and their fight for a safe space within the jail system, when we had the special housing units, that was trans people and LGBT people who needed the safe space within the prison because they were constantly being targeted and attacked. There's so many forms of and ways how activism has played out and made significant changes, even to the smallest thing.
I mean, it seems like it. I wonder what your feeling about that was. So, sort of like looking at this world, it's weird because it's like it's really hard to think about in part because you look at the shots of the meatpacking district now, and you're like, wow, what a beautiful, sunny, clean place it is. And then you look at the footage of what the 80s and 90s look like in that area, and it's like, oh, it looks post-apocalyptic. It looks like Mad Max or something like that. And a lot of people would look at that and be like, well, that's improvement, that the world is a better place. And I wonder, like, what is the story of transgender women alongside that? You know what I mean? Like, how much has life for that population improved? Because I mean, I live in California, so like homelessness in Los Angeles is unbelievable, and I know that population is struggling still.
Right.
And so and then you turn on like Twitter or whatever, and it's just like nothing but fucking douchebags talking about how much they hate trans people. So it seems like
Right.
it's hard to sort of, I guess, get a big perspective on what's going on.
And so here's the thing, and I realize, because I've been keeping track of, you know, this shift in media representation, right? And so now we're at a point where the trans conversation is in American living rooms, right? We can't escape it. It's every day now, right? And so we have this increased visibility, and people are now having this awareness of the plight of trans people. But there's still, discrepancies, like, the influx of transition stories. Like, there was a time where it was all about the transition, and we're going to tell transition stories. And this person is so brave and they're a hero, whatever the case may be, for transitioning.
Yes.
That's fine. You know what I mean? Yes, it is a bold move to come out as trans, right? But then there's also lived experience. And the fact that trans people is not something new. It's not because of a person just who transitioned last year.
Right.
You know what I mean? There are people with a lifetime of experience being a trans person. We've watched the world shift. You know what I mean? We see this representation. We see actors and actresses on the screen, and that's fine, right? But down to the root of it, visibility does not equal housing and healthcare.
Yeah.
Visibility does not equal, equity.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
And I mean,
So, I mean,
part of
that's
me
just a small part,
yeah. I mean,
a very small part. It's
watching your film, I was thinking like this film is about transgender women of color, sex workers. That's a very specific category, but it's also just a film about homelessness and poverty. Because I can imagine people's experiences are different. Not every trans person ended up on the streets of the meatpacking district.
no.
Right.
But some people had to retort to entertainment. Some people were in the bars. You know, if you weren't the biggest performer, you're still dancing. You have to do the dance, trainee dance is how I say it, where you're still receiving the bare minimum,
Mm-hmm.
right? Receiving the bare minimum. We don't have equity. We can't go and purchase homes and do all these things. It's still a struggle. Some of my trans sisters are still going to programs for Metro cards and pizza.
Right, right. I mean, that's the first
They're
line
not being
that struck me as the first lines of your film. It's just because you're telling your story in just a couple sentences, and you're talking about being rejected by like straight society, whatever you want to call that. But specifically, it's like from family, and then from the world of jobs, the world of being able to access money. And that part I think of is really striking because like when you're cut out from those places of support, where do you go? You like create new ones, I
exactly.
guess. Yeah.
And I mean, and let's face it, if you're a person of color in New York City in the 90s and early 2000s, that's already limited opportunities, even with
Mm-hmm.
affirmative action. You know what I mean? So, like, on top of that and being trans, then your chances of survival were
Well,
very,
yeah.
very
I mean, I
slim.
described I was thinking about the meatpacking district in this documentary as sort of an island of misfit toys. It's like these are the people who have been most cut out from all those different angles, whether it be gender or class or race. You're out of being able to navigate the world in the way that a lot of other people do.
Right. And especially if you were out, even so, I remember the coffee, I worked in a number of coffee places that I had some kind of discrepancy in regarding to queerness and transness, right? Like one of them was, oh, the white gay boys were good.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I
Mm-hmm.
mean?
Mm-hmm.
But as soon as you were a person of color, your worth wasn't as much of a worth as theirs. And I brung Cashmere, who was a young trans woman then, and she really wanted to get off the stroll, and I loved her. You know what I mean? Like I wanted to see her be great. She was a beautiful woman at the time, and she deserved everything. Like I was working in that coffee shop. I went in to get her a job in the wait staff because she was beautiful. She would have killed it. Personality, amazing. As soon as I brought her in, the wait staff woman looked at me, looked at her. I didn't get a call. My name was off the schedule and she didn't get a call back. So then I had gotten to another job in the meatpacking district. It was dead in the center of the meatpacking district where Patisse used to be, which is now that furniture store. And it was called Coffee Grind. And I would see the girls every night and I was presenting, I was starting my transition. So I would have on like, the typical wait staff outfit, like, black camisole with some black flared slacks or whatever the case may be. But when I got hired, they were like, oh, and don't let the trannies in here. And I was like, what? Because we don't want them coming in here, pulling any tricks in the bathroom or whatever the case may be. And I just was like, okay. But Josie, who you see in the film, towards the end, she would come in and all she wanted was some fucking hot chocolate. Yeah, she was dressed scandalous. But that was my girl, and she would sit and talk to me and tell me about her day. She would give me the Brandy's Never Say Never CD, and I would pop it in, and her favorite song was Sitting on Top of the World.
Mm.
And we would just key, and I would make her sandwiches, and she'd go back out to work, and she'd be like, "Loca, how you doing today?" She would come in and check on me every night. Then there was this one drag queen. It was a white drag queen. She was out there, and she told my boss that I had locked the shop up, and I was having a party with all the trans girls inside.
Uh-oh.
And I got fired, right?
Right.
Because they told me not to allow the trans women in the store. And then a few days later, I go past there, and that same drag queen was up out of them working in my position.
It's amazing how there's like it's a story of bullies in some ways, right? That like there's a group that everyone can kind of pile up on, and when other people see that it's okay to pile up on them, then even the fucking mayor can get on TV and pile up on them too. Like it just seems like it has its own energy to it there's so many different branches of your story. One of them, thinking about just like the story you just told, clothes, like how much this has to do with like clothes and the way people present themselves and how it drives people fucking crazy. Like if you're not like
Exactly.
dressed the right way.
And I used to tell them all the time, I'm like, you know what? You're kind of infringing on my constitutional right. I used to heckle
Totally.
the police this way. And it's like because I can dress however I want. I can express myself. Isn't that protected under the Constitution? I can speak to whoever I want to, and you just come and snatch me. I used to give them the business all the time. And then because I was, as a young person, we were going to the New Neutral Zone, which was a safe space for homeless LGBT youth. And I met a group of people in another program where we were learning about social justice and, the history of like oppression and racism in this country. And we were called pro radicals at the time, right? And, we wanted to start our own youth-based organization, and we did. And it was
Mm,
called Fierce. Fabulous Independent Educated Radicals for Community Empowerment. And it was those fierce kids that pretty much found Sylvia Rivera, brought her into this space, filmed her in a documentary called Fenced Out. She was hung around us until she died.
mm.
And this is how we
I
got
wondered
the,
what your experience with her was. Like how much you knew her.
I mean, I wasn't like directly up under her, but she was around us young people. And we went to, certain demonstrations and things, that she was at. It reinvigorated her, to be around the young people. And so she became an active force again for the community. At the
She
time,
went
she
through
was
a dark
fighting.
period, right?
Yes, she came out of that dark period because of the young people and the young people believing in her work, and her activism. And so when she reemerged out of her darkness, she was ready. She was fighting for secure housing for trans youth, and that was Sylvia's Place Shelter. It was the first emergency shelter in New York City for homeless LGBT youth. I happened to end up working there for over 10 years.
Mm,
You know what I mean? And then she was also fighting for the Gender Equality Non-Discrimination Act to ensure that trans people, or all people in general, work
mm.
without discrimination. And that only passed here in New York a couple of years ago.
Yeah, I mean the walking while trans thing was just repealed a couple years ago, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
it's nuts the history you tell. I mean, you have so many stories. I feel like you had this is the beginning of an illustrious career as a filmmaker and storyteller, and I hope it is. But one of the things that struck me about the film about just thinking about film and documentaries and how you tell these stories. You were in a documentary, right? Like the
I was in
opening
a
scene.
few documentaries
Right.
and
So what were those
multiple
like?
publications. It started with the newspaper articles and stuff, and they were really trying to like get into youth homelessness in New York City, the lack of beds and care for young people that are on the streets,
Mm,
right? And we had Sylvia's Place that was already like 2 or 3 years in its, fruition. And so it became a heavy topic, and then the cameras started coming. And I remember I was in the first one, I was with one of my friends, Kimmy, and she was the subject of a documentary, and it was called oh my God. It was like in the life, or not in the life, but I gotta remember the name.
with
But I,
life.
I was in there with her, and you see me, and like, I got my little bag lady. I used to get, go to Target and get these really big purses that ended up being like my whole entire house in there,
Mm,
and like we're eating or something, and they were following her. She was a little bit younger than me, so they were interested in her. But when we got to Queer Streets, there was a young person that I kind of took under my wing because she was, the kids, like, I remember what Pray Tell said in Pose, they come just as the day rises. Every day from everywhere in this country, kids are coming to New York City looking for a life because, it's the mecca of gay life, but New York City has its own problems.
right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
And it's not as easy as you think, especially when your ID don't match your gender identity, or, so they retort to sex work.
Hmm.
And who's going to look after them? You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
who's going to look after them? And so I kind of like was scared for her. So I kind of took her under my wing. I gave her a cell phone and was like, if anything happens, make sure you call me. I'm like the mama bird going out looking for them when they've disappeared for 3, 4, 5 days straight and you don't know what happened to them. and I got arrested looking for one of my kids one time. So it's just like, it was a lot. It was
It's
a lot,
and
but
those stories are incredible, and like the film you've made, shares a lot of them. But what's crazy about it, thinking about it, is thinking like, okay, I'm sitting here saying, why, exactly like you, why is this happening in this rich city? Why aren't more people helping these people that are on the edge? But the big story is like most New Yorkers are like, get these people out of here so we can fucking have a city. You know what I mean?
which
Like,
is funny 'cause today when they talk about protecting the children, and I'm like, but not too long ago, you weren't doing that. You're still not doing that.
right. It's like which people, which children are we talking about? You know what I mean?
Right. Are you trying to protect them so they don't become trans? But if they're trans, then you don't give a fuck about them.
Is there? I mean, we have to wrap up here, and there are a million different things we can talk about. But watching that RuPaul clip was a trip to me, partly because it felt like the kind of like tranny hooker or transvestite, whatever term there was in the '90s. There was a kind of jokey element to it that was very like, when you watch it in the context of this documentary, it feels very dehumanizing. It feels like, well, if
But
you're that person, like, then this is like you're made a joke in the culture. But I think in this context, I don't know, it totally flips the script on everything. How much of your documentary do you think was sort of made about gentrification? Is this a gentrification documentary?
it is a gentrification documentary because I think that's what ramped up the arrest before, like you see in the film, like before they used to chase us around and we hide in the trunks, right?
Yes.
Then it became like Vice Squad out there in vans. Like it got so advanced. I felt like sometimes like I was in a spy novel or something, like somebody's following me, or like I knew when that taxi cab that was the police and I'm like hit it on the West Side Highway and try to lose him. You know what I mean? Like
Right.
it got that intense. You
Well,
know what I
yeah.
mean? It got that intense.
The animations that you show in this film of like of people hiding from the cops, and then yeah, how that becomes, it's sickening to watch. But it's also a film that I can't recommend enough in terms of showing what I think exactly what your intent was, which is sort of a human face of the Highline Park. You have a line where you say, "How many times did I have to get arrested for this Highline Park to be built?" And that, to me, there's so much in that line because it connects the architecture and the sort of changes that came to New York City that we all talk about as the history, and then like here's what it looked like from this group of people. And so I just wanted to thank you for making a really valuable piece of history. And thank you for
Thank
joining me
you.
today. I appreciate it.
I thank you. I enjoyed this conversation. And maybe I'll come back on again.
Yeah, please do. I'd love to talk more. Well, all right, my friends. I think that's going to do it for today's Nostalgia Trap. I want to thank Kristen Lovell for a really fun conversation and for making a film that I think I'll be showing people for a long time. I had a really weird synchronicity after I got off the Zoom call talking with Kristen. She mentioned that Brandy song, Sittin' on Top of the World, which is a song that I honestly hadn't thought about or heard for a long time, maybe like 25 years, honestly. But after I was done with that Zoom call, I got in my car and some like Spotify random mix came on, and it was Brandy Sitting on Top of the World blasting out of my speakers all of a sudden. And it really underlined something for me. And I know you can read all sorts of weird shit into those synchronicities. I swear I'm not going to go too new age on you here. But for me, it just sort of underlined the deep connection I had. And I felt watching Kristen's story and the story of the people in the Meatpacking district. It's a really moving and intense story, and it doesn't surprise me that a Brandy song would provide some sort of connection there, whatever that means. So I hope you have a great week, and I hope you go check out the Stroll, and we'll be back soon. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.